Hi there. I'm Jill Eisenberger. I'm the CEO here at Stone Barns, and I have the great pleasure of giving you a brief introduction to Anna Lappé, our guest this evening. So I've had a few people ask me tonight why we're doing a lecture series that sits at the intersection of climate change and environment and agriculture. And Anna basically answered this for me in a recent interview she did with a reporter. And one of the things she talked about in that interview was the fact that a lot of people are surprised at the scale of the contribution that agriculture makes to global climate change. So nearly a third of our greenhouse gases come from our current agricultural system. But she said even more than that, they're surprised to learn that agriculture can be part of the solution to that problem. So not only can we change the way we practice agriculture to reduce that 1/3, we could actually change the way we practice agriculture to have a positive net impact on the climate crisis. And she talks in her literature and her thinking and her work about how smart approaches to regenerative agriculture show us that if you grow food in harmony with nature, you can promote environmental goals like biodiversity, ecosystems management and sustenance, you can mitigate climate. And I think these are really, really important ideas for all of us to understand and hopefully get excited about. And I think Anna does such a beautiful job of taking these ideas out of the abstract and getting us to think about how the food choices we make every day make them a reality. So she is one of 3 lecturers, stars, who will be with us this summer. Next week, we have Anna Chai and Nari Kai, who are the directors of Wasted, the Story of Food Waste. And then we have Marcia DeLange, who will paint a broad picture of what's going on related to the environment and agriculture. But now let me turn to Anna and just a few of her many, many accomplishments. She is a national best-selling and internationally recognized expert on food systems. She founded a media company, Real Food Media, which is a collaborative to help people around the country and around the world tell their stories about place and agriculture. She is the author or co-author of 3 books, her most recent of which is Diet for a Hot Planet, The Climate Crisis at the End of Your Fork and What You Can Do About It. And I'm very proud and grateful to share with you that she was a contributor to the book that we put together at Stone Barns, Letters to a Young Farmer. With her mother, Frances Moore Lappé, she founded the Small Planet Institute, which has given away more than $1 million to grassroots organizations. 2 of the organizations that they supported went on to become Nobel Prize winners. So like I said before, I think Anna is masterful at really breaking down some of the complex ideas that we try to talk about here at Stone Barns. And I love the way she talks about the story of agriculture and climate. She says we really need to intervene in 3 ways, or think about 3 things. The where. So where are we growing things and what kinds of things are well suited to grow in specific places? So we think about that a lot here. What does place-based agriculture look like? What is the ecosystem around us well designed to support? The what kinds of food production are we choosing now that have the greatest environmental impact? And could we make a different set of choices that have a lesser impact? And the how are we choosing to cultivate the foods that we need to grow to support the human race? And are there choices we can make that are less energy intensive and that lead to a more resilient future? So we're thrilled to have Anna here tonight to talk about these big ideas, and I would like all of you to join me in giving her a warm welcome to Stone Barns.
Well, I have to say, I had a public speaking first just now, which was my snack that they left me in the green room was so beautiful. I took a picture of it and texted it to my husband. I said, you know you're at Stone Barns when the snack you get is just picked Sungolds and apparently blueberries also from the farm and a beautiful piece of toasted bread with just the most beautiful dill on it. So thank you for that sustenance, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a huge honor to be here, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some reflections, some big ideas. So in January, I traveled to Kauai. How many of you have ever been to Kauai? a larger proportion of an audience than usual. So those of you who raised your hands know this is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. You can kind of see it there. And I was there partly for work and partly for a family vacation, to which my children did not complain. And one evening, we were out at this really beautiful little wine bar, and it was on the north, very lush side of the island, which felt at the time like a world away, even though it was only about an hour and a half's drive from the west side of the island, which is the non-touristy side, the side that's home to the native Hawaiian population, and the side that's also home to vast acres of genetically modified corn that's being field tested for pesticide resistance. But of course, nothing is really that far away on an island. And so chatting with our waitress, I told her why I was there and that I was there to learn about the impact of the world's largest chemical companies on this island that had really made Kauai ground zero for testing this pesticide resistance. And she said, oh yeah, I know about that. And then kind of in a softer voice, she kind of leaned in and she said, yeah, you know, my best friend, my best friend just had her first baby, and her baby was born with her intestines outside of her body. And she thinks it was because of the pesticides she was exposed to. And unfortunately, I knew exactly what she was talking about. It's a birth defect called gastroschisis, and it's associated with in utero exposure to pesticides. And since I had been on the island, I had been hearing about the increase of gastroschisis, along with a lot of other rare birth defects that doctors on the island were starting to notice and were concerned that it was associated with the pesticide spraying. More and more people on that west side of the island were being exposed to pesticides because of this boom in the chemical seed industry business there, and the pesticides that they were using. And just a side note here, a little terminology. The term pesticides, as many of you know, refers to that broad class of all chemicals that kill insects, kill fungus, kill rodents, kill plants. So there was this huge increase in pesticides, and at the same time, concerns not just from birth defects, but other health impacts that they were experiencing. And this was largely because over the past 2 decades, as the pineapple and sugar plantations have closed on the Hawaiian Islands, many of those plantations have been turned over to some of the largest chemical companies in the world. Companies like Dow, which is now Dow DuPont, and now they actually have a new name. They just rebranded themselves Corteva, coming from, I think, the words for heart and land. And these companies were drawn to Hawaii because of the warm climate. They're able to actually have multiple growing seasons where they're testing and developing these new GMOs. And also because they knew there was a labor force there that was really devastated by the loss of those plantations and willing to work in conditions that were exposing them to these toxic chemicals. And frankly, also because of a lack of regulatory oversight. Where do you think the nearest EPA office is? San Francisco. So with the arrival of these companies came the increase of these restricted use pesticides. This is an EPA designation for pesticides that are known to be toxic and so are only supposed to use with certain pesticide applicators and under certain conditions. And along with those were the increase of use of a whole range of other pesticides like the herbicides glyphosate, atrazine, the insecticide chlorpyrifos, which you'll hear me talk more about in a minute. And yet these companies, when they're using these chemicals, many, as I said, known to be toxic, they're using them on land. You can kind of see it in this picture, I hope. You can see the plots of land abutting neighborhoods, abutting schools, hospitals. There was no requirement for any buffer zones. There was no requirement for any disclosure of what was being sprayed when. And I was standing when I was visiting. I stood on a bluff above some of these fields. And if you've ever been to Hawaii, you know the trade winds blow all of the time. So when you think about pesticide drift, it becomes very, very real as that wind is whipping your hair. And while I was there, I heard about workers who'd been exposed, sickened from pesticide exposure, about school kids who'd fallen ill from pesticide drift near their schools, about communities with increasing rates of asthma, cancers, other illnesses, and of course also about gastroschisis. And so what I want to talk about tonight is how did we get here? How did we get to a place where our food system is dependent on such toxic chemicals, ones that mimic estrogen and disrupt our hormones, ones that damage our brain, lower our IQ, cause ADHD, Parkinson's, depression, ones that damage cell function and lead to cancers and other illnesses. How did we come to turning really one of the most beautiful places on the planet into the home of monoculture, genetically modified corn dependent on toxic pesticides? How do we get to a place where our food system, tied as it is to factory farming, where much of that corn is destined, is, as Jill was talking about, responsible for 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions driving our climate crisis? And to me, the answer to that question is a complicated one we will not resolve tonight, but I want to get into where I think some of the heart of that answer is, which is it comes down to power, to politics, and it cuts to the heart of what we believe the role of us, Homo sapiens, is on the planet. And it's a story of a battle of worldviews, and it's a story of resistance emerging around the world. From the fields that you can maybe not see from these windows, but is very near to us, from fields like these, to places like Bhutan, and even to the islands of Hawaii. And it's a story that's really connected to my family. That's me and my older brother. Some of you may know my mother's work. She wrote Diet for a Small Planet 2 years before I was born. So the story of food runs deep in my veins. This is a picture of a typical family vacation. You might notice that is not Disneyland. No, that is Antigua, Guatemala, where my mother took my brother and me on a research trip she was doing about land reform there. And it's a story that's connected to my father, who was a toxicologist and epidemiologist, a crusader against corporations whose chemicals impacted society's most vulnerable. His most proud work was work he did on behalf of farm workers who were exposed to chemicals in the fields, and in his own community fighting roadside spraying of toxic plant-killing chemicals. And it's a story, like so many of us, that's really connected so intimately to my family. My father died of glioblastoma brain cancer. My mother survived breast cancer. My paternal grandmother died of thyroid cancer. My maternal grandmother of leukemia. My grandfather of prostate cancer. My youngest daughter has had 2 surgeries to treat 2 different birth defects. So were any of these the result of pesticide exposure? Of what chemical? When? We'll never know. But what we do know is that we live with these chemicals all around us. And we do know that there is not a child born today without pesticide residues in her body. So how we got here? How we got here goes back to war. As Rachel Carson observed in Silent Spring, this pesticide industry, which is all around us today, is a child of the Second World War. Novel chemical weapons like nerve gases, as well as insecticides to kill lice and mosquitoes, were all developed in the war effort. And after the war ended, the companies behind this chemical arsenal needed to create new markets. And the modern day age of better things for better living through chemistry was born. It was born in our kitchens and on our lawns and on our farms. And hand in hand with these chemicals, with the rise of these chemicals, was increasing industrialization of agriculture, defined in part by moving away from diversified farms to monoculture ones, vast acres devoted to a single crop. Monoculture farming set the stage for, as Rachel Carson put it, an explosive increase in specific insect populations that were responded to by pesticides. Since the mid-1990s, we've seen genetically modified seeds, or GMOs, come onto the market as the latest iteration of this industrial farming. Most have been designed just to express one of 2 traits, or combination of both. They're either engineered with a gene from a soil bacterium to produce a protein toxic to certain pesticides, or they've just been designed to be resistant to a plant killer like Monsanto's Roundup or the herbicide glyphosate. All told, actually 98% of all GMO acreage in the US is planted with crops engineered to withstand one or more of these plant-killing pesticides. My friend, the journalist Tom Philpott, likes to describe GMOs as like helicopter parents. He said that this model of farming, you see an insect, you spray it. You see a weed, you spray it. And at the end of the day, you get crops that are totally incapable of being independent and resilient. So many of the chemicals used on these GMO fields, of course, we've known for decades, are not good for us. Chemicals like dicamba, 2,4-D, atrazine, and chlorpyrifos. Consider chlorpyrifos. Some of you may be familiar with this insecticide. I didn't know how you pronounced it until just a few months ago, and I still get a bit tongue-twisted. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times just calls it a brain-damaging insecticide. It was developed as a Nazi nerve gas, and it is today among the most widely used pesticides in the US. Dow sells more than 5 million pounds of it domestically, and there is no known safe level for children exposed to chlorpyrifos. While it was banned for indoor use in 2001, it is still widely used. It's used on roadsides, in parks, and on farms. Chlorpyrifos, of course, is just one of the thousands of pesticide formulations in use on industrial farms, and only a tiny fraction of these reach their intended targets. You can find traces of these chemicals now everywhere, from rivers and oceans to soils and grasses, from the rainforests of South America to the Arctic ice to our bodies. And in addition to this reliance on chemical pesticides, this way of farming relies on synthetic fertilizer as well, with dire consequences. Of the 120 million tons of synthetic nitrogen used in industrial agriculture annually, much of it, in some places as much as 70% of it, is never taken up by the crops at all, but leaches in to our waters, causing incredible environmental impacts like dead zones. There are now 400 dead zones around the world, including one in the Gulf of Mexico, which just last year grew to the largest it has ever been. So why has this technology, why has these pesticides spread so far despite these impacts? And why has a different path not been taken, one that's based on ecological principles? In large part, as I said, I believe so much of it has to do with power, the power of those that have a vested interest in the status quo. So one of my favorite quotes from Langdon Winner, who writes about technology, he writes that technologies embody specific forms of power and authority, and that there is this ongoing social process in which scientific knowledge, technological innovation, and corporate profit reinforce each other in deeply entrenched patterns that bear the unmistakable stamp of political and economic power. It's a lot, but I figured this audience could handle it. Because what it says is I feel like there is this idea so much of us have about technology, that what we see flourishing, the technologies that are successful, the technologies that are implemented the most, must be the most efficient. They must be the smartest. They must be the best. When in fact, technology is not neutral. The technologies that thrive are the technologies that are best suited for those that have the power to spread them. And that political and economic power in our food system, consider that the global pesticide industry just raked in $50 billion in sales last year. The global fertilizer industry is expected to top $245 billion by 2020. And the global industrial meat sector, to which much of the soy and the corn that's being grown with all those pesticides and fertilizers itself is a $90 billion market. Meanwhile, those most impacted from these pesticides, from these fertilizers, the farm workers, immigrant workers, low-income communities, those most impacted have the least economic and political power. And we know that these vested interests, they aggressively promote this certain kind of technology, this chemical agriculture. They do it through lobbying with, I just crunched the numbers just the other day, there are now twice as many registered lobbyists for agribusiness as there are members of Congress. They do this aggressive push of their technology through attacking scientists who expose this harm, discrediting research on the real cost of industrial agriculture, and lobby against and lobby for research dollars for more chemical agriculture. So it should come as no surprise that globally, less than 2% of all public and private research dollars are going to non-chemical approaches. When Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, she noted that only 2% of all entomologists were studying non-chemical biological approaches to agriculture. But this authority of this industrial model, I think, also comes from a worldview that is promoted by these vested interests, a story that we tell ourselves about the nature of nature. And this is a story that has become so dominant that I don't even think we always notice it's there. It's a story that nature is inherently competitive, that species vie for scarce resources, and it's a story that nature needs us to control it, to tame it, to kill it when necessary so that we can have our crops grow. It's a story that gives rise to pesticide names like predator and harness, in pesticide industry ad campaigns that talk about farmers needing an arsenal of chemicals. It's a story that we human beings, us brilliant human beings, can take on nature in its tiniest parts. We can kill this bug here, attack this plant there. It is a story without a systems lens. And yet Rachel Carson wrote in her infinite wisdom that this control of nature, that story that we have of controlling nature, is a phrase, as she put it, conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. And she writes, "It's our alarming misfortune that so primitive a science has armed itself with the most modern and terrible weapons, and that in turning them against the insects, it has also turned them against the earth." This humans need to control nature, and nature is competitive. This conjoined narrative, I feel, really dominates our popular culture and mainstream science reporting. If any of you have ever watched a Planet Earth episode, you would have heard this dominant narrative. I tuned in to a Planet Earth episode thinking, oh, could I possibly find an example of David Attenborough and his amazing British accent expressing this dominant narrative? And the very first episode that I rewatched, Jungles, in the very first lines that he said did exactly that. And I will not do a British accent for you, but he said, in the Jungles episode, "Jungles are lush paradises, dense, crowded places where spider monkeys, jaguars, and even river dolphins must compete to survive. Paradise is crowded, life fills every niche, and at any one time, a staggering variety of species and countless individuals are striving for space and food. Every jungle animal must find their own way to survive in the most competitive place on Earth." So yes, David Attenborough is right, paradise is quite crowded, but that doesn't mean that the birds and the bees, the monkeys and jaguars are competing. There's another worldview. It's a worldview embraced by ecologists like Rachel Carson, farmers around the world practicing ecological methods, and one embraced by indigenous communities all across the planet. It's an ecological worldview that sees cooperation, not just competition, at the heart of nature, that sees cooperation as nature's dominant organizing principle. I told my colleague, Toby Herlick, about this David Attenborough quote. She's an expert on biomimicry, and she laughed out loud, and she said to me, she said, that nature, as she put it, is defined by deeply interconnected relationships with organisms co-evolved so that often competition is not even necessary. And she talked about the jungle. And she gave the example of the jungle orchid, diverse in size and shape and color. And she described how bees in the jungle pollinate these orchids, where you can have as many as 11 or more different orchid species across one pollination path. To avoid cross-pollinating, she explained, each orchid has evolved a unique position for its pollen collectors, which enables the bee to deposit pollen as it moves along its path only on the flowers from the orchid's species mate. It's just one example of how species have co-evolved, developing adaptations to thrive in biodiversity and that oh-so-crowded paradise. But it's this understanding of the natural world as codependent, as mutually supportive, that I think is at the heart of the ecological mindset and at the heart of this revolution in how we think about agriculture. It's a kind of ecological agriculture that rejects toxic pesticides and synthetic fertilizer. In Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she beautifully writes about this mutualism. A member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, she describes the classic Native American polyculture of growing three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, together. As Kimmerer says, they're not competing with each other. They're planted together, supporting each other. The corn stands upright with all that access to light, but it's nutrient limited. The beans get their light by twining up the ladder of the corn, and underground, they're fixing nitrogen that feeds the corn. Then there's the third sister, the squash. Those big umbrella leaves shade the soil and keep it moist and suppress weeds. And they're prickly. They help keep out a lot of insect herbivores. Instead of competing, they're complementary. They help each other out the way sisters do. And they end up producing more food than if they were grown alone. But this worldview, this cooperative worldview, this ecological worldview, it's threatening. It's threatening not just to the big pesticide and synthetic fertilizer industries that I described earlier, but it's threatening to large landowners that have profited from industrial agriculture, threatening the fossil fuel sector, and some of the world's biggest investors who also profit from the pesticide and synthetic fertilizers at the heart of industrial agriculture. It also even threatens, I believe, those concerned with what we humans might learn about ourselves from the natural world's mutualism. So in the first half of the last century, an ecologist named Frederick Clements brought these ideas of mutualism to his field. In his studies of bayous and chaparrals and hardwood forests and prairies, he talked about this mutualism. And in an essay in the new book, Drawdown, Janine Benyus, one of the mother of biomimicry, writes about this. And she writes about how Clement saw these distinct communities of plants reacting not just to soil and climate, but also to each other. And he talks about how plants are cooperators, facilitating each other in those beneficial ways that you heard me describe about the three sisters. And in Clement's work, he talks about the canopy trees who help saplings beneath their branches, and they shade seedlings from the sun. They block the wind and fertilize their soil with their leaves. His was this plant helping plant worldview. And this view was dominant in the field of ecology, dominant until, as Janine Benyus notes, Clement's fall from grace coincided to the year with the release of the Truman Doctrine and the onset of the Cold War. And what took his place was the philosophy of another scientist, Henry Gleason. And in Gleason's framework, there was no mutual aid in nature. Plants were all merely competing for a spot in the struggle, which sounds very David Attenborough-y to me. And as Janine Benyus wrote, even when talking about plants, you dared not talk about communism. But if you believe that this inherent dynamic of nature is competitive, well, then it follows that you see humans' role not as a role of tapping into nature's cooperative essence, but that command and control role that you heard Rachel Carson critiquing. It follows, too, that you don't perceive the cascade of impacts when you target one organism, a plant or a bug, in this complicated web. You don't see the damage you do when you remove one of those mutualists. But what if there were another way to perceive nature? And what if we were to perceive this inherent abundance in natural cycles and this cooperation at the heart of nature? What if we were to really understand those insights of Robin Wall Kimmerer? And what I am pleased to see is that increasingly farmers, scientists, agricultural experts around the world are doing just that. They're tapping into natural systems to unleash abundance and foster resilience, all without the threat of toxic chemicals, water pollution, or any of the other externalities of the industrial model. They're tapping into the mutualism inherent in nature through practices known by various terms, including the term agroecology, which refers to the science, the movement, the practice of using natural systems to grow food and to grow food abundantly. It's a way of farming that's moving really into the center of the conversation about how we will feed the future, particularly in the light of the climate crisis. In its most recent report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, stressed these ecological approaches, raising diverse crops, using techniques like agroforestry, growing and raising cattle with rotational grazing, mimicking how livestock used to move in herds. A decade ago, this vision was codified in the food world's equivalent to an IPCC report. It was called Agriculture at the Crossroads. And the report was contributed to by hundreds of experts all around the world from almost more than 100 countries. And the report assessed the agricultural methods and techniques needed for sustainable development. Its conclusion was clear. We need to shift food systems away from agrochemicals and genetically engineered seeds. The report wrote, if we do persist with business as usual, the world's people cannot feed themselves. It will mean more environmental degradation, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots will expand. So what does it mean to transform business as usual? It means embracing this ecological worldview, with mutualism at its heart. It means working with nature to manage pests and weeds and build soil fertility, promoting biodiversity, crop and open pollinated seeds, encouraging saving seeds, sharing seeds. And all around the world, movements are connecting to promote just this kind of farming and seeing incredible benefits. I'm an advisor to a global philanthropic initiative called the Agroecology Fund. We support agroecological movements all around the world, and so we get to hear about these incredible successes on the ground. We get to hear about efforts like the largest social movement in the world, the peasant movement La Via Campesina, that counts 164 local and national organizations from 73 countries, representing 200 million farmers all around the world. Now, we've been told by pesticide promoters that we need chemicals to harvest nature's bounty, but that is not what I am hearing on the ground. I recently went to a conference of the International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements, or IFOAM, which is a bit of a mouthful and also not a great acronym, but they gathered to share the stories and share the research of what they were finding. And I got to hear from farmers from Costa Rica that talked about the thousands of farmers that were adopting organic practices and getting more food and reducing their indebtedness. I got to meet leaders from Fiji who described the movement on their islands to turn the land into all agroecological farming. I got to meet the Minister of Agriculture from Bhutan, who's committed his country to going 100% organic and who is well on the way of getting there. I got to hear about the success of an organic farming movement in India in the state of Andhra Pradesh, where in 2004, local farmers started experimenting with non-pesticide management, as they called it, using natural alternatives to toxic pesticides to tackle insects like the pod borer, which feasts on lentils and okra, sorghum, and peas. These farmers learned to use natural controls, like manually removing infected leaves, like spraying an extract of neem seeds, like introducing a naturally occurring virus. And the results? The insects were kept in check, the yield stayed steady, and farmers who spent less on chemicals had higher incomes. Within 4 years, the program has expanded to 340,000 farmers all across the state. Now, we know that studies from around the world are finding the results that we saw in Andhra Pradesh, that you can cut back on, even eliminate the herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides, and often not see a huge drop in productivity, and almost always see a huge increase in profitability for the farmers. One study by the University of Essex looked at 286 different ecological farming projects around the world, and they found that on average there was a yield increase of 79%. Among just those projects in Africa alone, they found average yields rose 116%. Here at home, farmers are embracing these agroecological practices too. This picture is from New Forest Farms in western Wisconsin, where I visited Mark Shepard, a farmer there, who took over a 106-acre farm and has turned it is deploying these agroecological practices. The first time I visited him, it was just after Wisconsin had been hit by a terrible, terrible flood event that the state was had a bill of millions of dollars to support farmers who'd been impacted by it. So when I was visiting him, I was slightly worried I would be arriving to meet a devastated farmer, considering his farm had been bombarded by the very same rain that had devastated so many other farmers in the state. But when I arrived at his farm, he and his farm intern were actually lounging in hammocks and looking quite happy and did not look so devastated. And he proceeded to explain to me why his farm survived in the face of this extreme flooding event, while his neighbor corn farmers were so devastated. What he did to foster that resilience? The answer comes from this different way of perceiving natural systems. It comes from rethinking nature and understanding the interconnectivity between the plants and the nematodes and the fungus and the insects, what the chemical industry dubs as pests and deploys billions of pounds of pesticides to do away with every year. Farmers like Mark see as helpful mutualists. And so if you're a chemical farmer, as soon as you perceive a harm, you spray. But what Mark was showing me on his farm, he was letting the populations of insects run naturally. And as he did, insects would arrive to eat and thrive on those original so-called pests. Eventually, he described a certain kind of stability. And that's why he likes to describe himself as a population ecologist, not in the bug-killing business. Go to his farm and you see this, much like you see this on the farms here. I'm sure you see you hear the buzzing of the insects and the singing of the birds, and you see the incredible life on the farm. But despite stories like Mark's and research from around the world, and the success we're seeing in places like Andhra Pradesh, or the fact that the vast majority of the world's food, 70%, still comes from small-scale farms, we still don't hear that this is a solution. Instead, we hear that the industrial model is the only way to feed the world. But what I am struck by is that despite the fact that there is still such a dominant narrative about how industrial farming is the only way to feed the world, we are starting to see this emergence by groups like IFOAM and La Via Campesina, like farmers like Mark Shepard, taking off, where you're seeing farmers embrace agroecological solutions, where scientists are creating new research institutions to support them, and communities are standing up and sometimes even winning. So this week, in addition to being here with you tonight, I brought leaders from Kauai to New York City. And in a way, they're kind of on a victory lap of sorts. Concerned about those impacts that I described to you in the beginning of my talk, community groups started organizing on the islands, fighting for years to demand regulation, led largely by women who saw up close and personal the impact and the personal toll of unregulated spraying. Malia Chun is one of these women. She was a mother, cultural practitioner who lives in one of the most pesticide-impacted communities in Kauai. When children in her community were tested in 2015, she learned that there were residues of 38 different pesticides in her own daughter's hair. Working with partners from local groups to national organizations, she and thousands of others organized and worked together to craft legislation that would protect local communities from these toxic chemicals. It was an uphill battle. As you can imagine, the chemical industry is a powerful lobby in Hawaii. Locally, it's a main source of jobs, and the chemical industry lobbyists had money to vastly outspend the grassroots. In 2013, they won a huge regulatory victory, with 3 counties passing legislation that would have put in place a suite of common sense policies. Chemical companies would have been required to disclose what they were spraying, when they were spraying it. They would have created a mandatory birth defect registry. They would have created buffer zones around schools. The day after this policy passed in 2013, the chemical industry sued. They sued every single one of the counties and said, you cannot regulate at the county level. The state preempts county decisions. It went all the way to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the communities lost. It was devastating. It definitely took them a while to regroup, but they regrouped and they organized again. And they worked from 2013 for years to reorganize to build a statewide coalition, to develop a statewide policy. And in June this year, the organizers celebrated their hard-fought victory. The governor of Hawaii signed into legislation a comprehensive statewide bill that establishes buffer zones around schools, that requires mandatory disclosure on pesticide use, that requires an environmental assessment of chemical spraying, and that, for the very first time in this country, has put a ban on agricultural use of the brain-damaging insecticide chlorpyrifos. So in 1968, exactly 50 years ago, we saw this picture for the first time. We saw Earth from space. The crew of Apollo 8 left our orbit, passed behind the far side of the moon, and they took this picture. And it captured the world's imagination. There it was, our home, just this really small blue orb floating in the immense dark universe. This picture is said to have helped spawn this modern-day environmental movement, to have helped to strengthen the ecological worldview that is grounded in this understanding of the interconnectedness of life on Earth. Our planet is an island. What happens in one place affects us all. The activists from Hawaii understood this basic truth. Rachel Carson did too. So do those in states around the country that are now calling for a similar ban on chlorpyrifos. And so do all of us who are demanding chemical-free farming. We know this to be true. Nothing is far away on an island. Thank you.